Vasudeva Sutam Devam Kamsachanuramaddanam Devaki Paramanandam Krishno Vande Jagadgurum. Hello everyone, good to see you again. So last time we covered up to Shloka 33 of chapter 2 of the Bhagavad Gita, in which Bhagavan Krishna tells Arjuna, if you do not do your duty as a Kshatriya, as a warrior, fighting on the right side of a war, fighting for justice, what will happen? You will lose glory, you will incur sin. And then somebody asked a very interesting question. Who was it that asked the question? You asked last week, right? Yes. I thought that in spiritual life, you shouldn't care what other people think of you. And this is very interesting. So I promised that I would get back to it. Somebody else, right? What was his name? The person who asked the question? You don't remember. Okay. So anyway, what I said that last week when he had asked that question is that let's go through a few more shlokas and then we'll get the answer, hopefully. So now let's continue with the next shloka, shloka 34. I'll repeat one pada and then you repeat after me. I'll recite one pada, you repeat. Akirtim chapi bhutani kathaishanti te vyayam sambhavitasya cha kirti maranat atirichyate. Okay, so now I'm following the Anvaya, so please follow along. This is a rearrangement of the words to make the meaning clearer. Apicha bhutani te avyayam akitim kathaishanti. And people will be speaking ill of you, saying bad things about you for a long time, and it'll leave an indelible stain on your character. Sambhavitasya. Sambhavitasya is a person of noble standing, a dignified person, somebody who is well respected in the society. Sambhavitasya cha akitihi maranat atirichyate. For that kind of person, a noble person, a dignified person, a cultured person, being held in low esteem is worse than death. Again, you may say, well, aren't there worse things than being called names and being thought ill of? That's true, but again, we have to think about a few things. Number one, thank you, is that remember that Arjuna is a Kshatriya, he's a warrior. And it's part of the dharma of a Kshatriya to value honor. This is very important. In all countries, you'll find that soldiers, one of the main values is honor and bravery. These are things which are held in high regard for good reason. Because every duty will have its respective virtues. So in the case of fighting for a just cause, bravery, valor, honor are extremely important. So he's speaking to Arjuna as a Kshatriya. That's the first thing to keep in mind. But we can also go a little deeper. But let's first go to the next shloka, 35. Bhayad ranat uparatam mamsyante tvam maharatha yesham chatvam bahumato bhutva yasyasi laghavam. Good. Yesham cha tvam bahumataha maharatha. Those maharathas, those great warriors who are also, warriors, who thought very highly of you. Bahumataha. Tvam bahumataha. Bhayat ranat uparatam mamsyante. They're now going to think that you fled the battle out of fear. Think that you're a coward. Laghavam yasyasi. And you will thereby attain laghavam. It's very interesting. Literally, it means lightness. It means you lose the weightiness of your dignity, of your honor. You lose your noble standing. And then finally, this thought finally concludes with shloka 36, unless you have questions about this before. And as I said, I'll answer that person's question finally when we get to the next shloka. Okay. So, shloka 36. Avachyavadamscha bahun vadishyanti tavahitaha nindantas tavasamathyam tato dukkataram nukim. Good. Okay, what is Bhagavan Krishna saying? Tava ahitaha, and those who are not your well-wishers, your enemies, people who don't like you, ahitaha. Tava samathyam nindantaha, insulting your abilities, saying this guy is good for nothing, he's useless, he's a coward. Bahun avachya vadancha vadishyanti, they're going to say a lot of nasty things about you. Tataha dukkhataram kimnu, what could be worse than this? So now we can finally get to the question of that bright student from last week who said, why should anybody care about what your enemies say? Obviously, your enemies are not going to say nice things about you. Why should we be bothered? Yeah, it's not just enemies, of course. In the previous slokas, Krishna has also said, even those who are your well-wishers, who thought very highly of you, will start criticizing you because they'll say that you fled the battle out of cowardice and so on and so forth. Now, we get to that question asked last week. Why should we bother about what people say, either negative or positive? First of all, as I said, the first part of this answer is because Arjuna was a Kshatriya. And these are very important virtues. Honor, bravery, right? So this is the first part. Please mute your mics, please, anybody who's online, so that the recording is not disturbed. Thank you. But there's a deeper issue here, okay, which these 4 shlokas raise, shlokas 32 through 36. The question that's raised is, how should we take criticism? This is a very practical question. There's not a single human being on earth who has not been criticized by somebody at some time in his or her life, right? So how should we take criticism? This is a very good question. Hello. We have a big crowd today. Okay. So, and you might say, going back to this person's question from last week, I wish I knew that. Were you the one who asked the question last week? There you go. What's your name again? Naman. Naman asked the question last week. Yes, so he's here now. It's good. So he can. Well, you want to rephrase the question? Do you remember what the question was? Remember, the context was that Krishna was telling Arjuna, if you don't fight in this war, then there are also the bad consequences. People will criticize you. And I think that your question was, why should Arjuna be bothered by people who criticize? Something like that. Because in other places in the Gita, we're told, like for instance, in chapter 5, Tulya ninda stutir mauni santushto yena. Bhagavan Krishna is describing in chapter 12, one of the highest bhakta is somebody who's tulya ninda stutihi, equal to praise and blame. Maybe this is not exactly a question, but I'm extrapolating for my own purposes. So what does Bhagavan Krishna mean by being equal in praise and blame? Does it mean you shouldn't care? You shouldn't even think about either of them. When people praise you, ignore it. When people criticize you, ignore it. I don't think that's what he means. Yeah, exactly. Right. Should we care about what others think? So this is the question. I think that there's a deeper significance to tulya ninda stutihi. Think about it this way. I'm giving a lecture, as I often do these days, and somebody criticizes me. That criticism can fall into 2 categories. One is, it's a valid criticism. It's possible that it's a valid criticism, I often get this criticism that I speak too quickly. This is a valid criticism. If it's a valid criticism, instead of getting angry about it or depressed about it, what should you do? Maybe you should think about it, and maybe you can try to improve in the future, avoid the same mistake in the future, right? This is one kind of criticism, possible criticism. Another kind of criticism is baseless criticism, what's called ad hominem. You know what ad hominem means? Does anyone know what ad hominem attack means? AD and then HOMINEM. A personal attack. It's a personal attack rather than actually focusing on the substance of what I'm saying you're stupid, you're you're foolish, you're from the US. I got that criticism in one YouTube comment. It's very funny. He's from the US, the Americans are stupid. So that falls in the second category. Criticism which is completely baseless, unfounded, unjustified. How should I respond to that kind of criticism? Think about it. How would you respond to criticism that's completely unjustified or baseless? Any of you? Exactly. Don't take it to heart. Why should you be bothered by it? So in either case, either the criticism is valid, and you should, if you're really a spiritual aspirant, even if you're not a spiritual aspirant, but you're just a person who has a growth mindset. This is the term used by Carol Dweck, a Stanford professor, a psychologist. If you have a growth mindset, then you'll want to learn as much as you can from your successes, from your failures, from criticisms. So then you should welcome criticism as long as it's constructive and helpful. And there's some foundation for it, some justification for it. But you should not get depressed. You should not get angry, right? And if it's baseless, then you really shouldn't care. You might even enjoy it, as I sometimes do. So this is a different way of understanding Tulya Nindastati, it seems to me. When Bhagavan Krishna, much later in the Gita, if we ever get to it, maybe late in the semester, well, almost certainly not, next year maybe, chapter 12. What does it mean to be equal to praise and blame? It means when somebody praises you, you don't get puffed up with pride and pat yourself on the back and say, oh, I'm really great. You shouldn't react like that. And when you get criticism, you shouldn't become depressed. You shouldn't get angry. You should take it. You should be even-keeled when facing both praise and criticism. If you get praise, be happy. Offer the fruits to God and say it's by God's grace that I've been successful. And because I'm getting this praise, it's some indication that I'm moving in the right direction, something like that. And if you get criticism, as I said, if it's valid, then you can learn from it. So here, now coming back to Arjuna's case, what kind of criticism would Arjuna receive if he were to refrain from engaging in this battle? Which category of criticism would that be? Would that fall under? The valid criticism or the baseless criticism? Yeah, why? Why valid? He's not doing his duty, actually. He is a Kshatriya, and he's supposed to be fighting for justice, to help others, to help humanity, and to fight evil. And if he doesn't do it, then people should be justly criticizing him, right? So that's why he should care about this kind of criticism, these insults. These are not baseless ad hominem attacks. He is failing to do his duty, and he should take it to heart. And that's a great humiliation, because there's nothing worse than to be told that the thing you love and that the thing you're born to do, that you don't do it well. So this is my approach. If you guys have anything more to add about that, are you satisfied or you're not quite satisfied? The person who asked it, no one, more or less. Think about it, and if you come up with if you have any doubts, let me know. Okay. So I think that's enough for that circle. Let's move on to 37. Bhagavan Krishna shifts gears a little bit in the next shloka. So as I said, from 33 to 36, he's been emphasizing how if you don't do your duty, your peers who held you in high regard will insult you, criticize you, and it's impossible to bear. Now, interestingly, let's read this next one. Hato va prapsyasi swargam jitva va bhokshase mahim tasmaduttishta uttishta tasmad uttishta. A bit of a tongue twister. Kaunteya Yudhaya Krita Nishchayaha. Good. Okay, Krishna, what is he saying? Let's look at the Anvaya. This is chapter 2, shloka 37, by the way. Okay. Hataha va swargam prapsyasi. If you're killed, what happens? You go to heaven. What a wonderful thing. It's a win-win situation. So that's the first side of the win-win. Jitva va mahim bhokshase. And if you win, what happens? You enjoy everything on this earth. You enjoy this whole earth. You'll be a hero. Tasmat he kaunteya, O Arjuna, O Kaunteya, yudhaya krita nishchayaha uttishta. Get up off your butt and fight in this war. Because it's a win-win situation. So now, why did I say that Krishna is shifting gears here? Because now he's emphasizing that so prior to that, he's kind of emphasizing mostly, you're a Kshatriya, your duty is to fight in a just war. So it's more like duty for duty's sake. Now he's saying, if you do your duty well, you will get very great results, regardless of whether you win the battle or not. So now Krishna is focusing on the fruits of his actions. And you're going to enjoy great happiness in heaven or great happiness here on earth. Either way, either you're killed and you go to heaven, it's very nice, probably better than this earth. Or you don't get killed, you win the battle, you stay here, but you're like a king. What could be better? So some people are puzzled by this shloka. They say, well, the Bhagavad Gita has sublime spiritual teachings, Vedāntic teachings. So why is Krishna now emphasizing these lower, almost worldly results? You can enjoy this earth and this and that. Sri Aurobindo has, I think, something very insightful to say. So can you click the second to the left, second from the left button? That's Sri Aurobindo's commentary. As usual, the commentary is not quite, it doesn't have everything that we're looking for here. So I'm going to read one sentence before the app commentary starts, and then we'll read the app commentary. So listen carefully because it's not here. Sri Aurobindo says, in the context of this shloka, Indian ethics has always seen the practical necessity of graded ideals for the developing moral and spiritual life of man. Graded ideals. Now we can follow the app. This, says Krishna in effect, is my answer to you. If you insist on joy and sorrow and the result of your actions as your motive of action, if you're not moved by the idea of doing your duty for duty's sake, or that because you're the Atman, there's no need to mourn the people who are being killed, then let me tell you the perks of doing your duty. What are the perks? I have shown you in what direction the higher knowledge of self in the world points you. These are in the previous shlokas. I have now shown you in what direction your social duty as a Kshatriya and the ethical standard of your order point you. Swadharmam api cha avekshya. From the standpoint of your duty as a Kshatriya. Whichever you consider, the result is the same. Then he says, coming down one notch from that, Sri Aurobindo says, but if you are not satisfied with your social duty and the virtue of your order, maybe Arjuna is saying, why should I follow my duty? Maybe the Kshatriya dharma is not a good one. It's a sinful one because it involves killing or something like that. If you think that leads you to sorrow and sin, then I bid you rise to a higher and not sink to a lower ideal. So what Krishna is saying here is that if you're not convinced by just doing duty for duty's sake, do it at the very least, because if you do your duty well, you'll get good benefits either in heaven, good results either in heaven or here on earth. Then this is segueing into the next shloka actually. So we got to go to the next shloka. Once again, Bhagavan Krishna shifts gears. As I said, graded ideals, as Sri Aurobindo says. Bhagavan Krishna starts with the highest teachings. We are not the body. We are not the mind. We're actually eternal souls, which can never be killed. Then coming down one notch, he talks about Arjuna's duty as a kshatriya, and that you should, if you this is your duty, and if you do it well, that's the greatest thing you can do. And then coming down one more notch, if that doesn't persuade you, keep in mind that if you do your duty well, you'll get great results from it. Now, sloka 38. Sukha dukkhe same kritva labha labhau jaya jayau tato yuddhaya yujyasva naivam papam avapsyasi. Good. Jaya ajaya, victory, defeat. Labha alabho, gain and loss. Sukha dukkhe is very obvious, right? Happiness, sorrow. Samekritva, they're all the same, making them all the same to you. Notice this is very different from the previous sloka. Tataha yuddhaya yujyasva. Having done that, having cultivated this equanimity of mind, where you remain the same in the midst of all circumstances, good or bad, fortunate, unfortunate, misery, sorrow, what do? You should get up and fight. Evam papam na avapsasi. In this way, you will not incur sin, right? So this is clearly, again, coming up a notch and saying, but really you shouldn't be coveting the fruits of what you do. You should do your duty for duty's sake, and you shouldn't bother about the results. Okay. And again, I think that he has a nice commentary here. So let's open the commentary for this one. It's a little bit long. You see his language is very nice. Sri Aurobindo says, it is the creed of the Aryan fighter. Know God, it says. It meaning that creed, the creed of the Kshatriya. Know thyself, help man, protect the right, do without fear or weakness or faltering thy work of battle in the world. Thou art the eternal and imperishable spirit. Thy soul is here on its upward path to immortality. Life and death are nothing. Sorrow and wounds and suffering are nothing, for these things have to be conquered and overcome. Look not at thy own pleasure and gain and profit, but above and around. Above at the shining summits to which thou climbest, around at this world of battle and trial in which good and evil, progress and retrogression are locked in stern conflict. Men call to thee, their strong man, their hero for help. Help then, fight. Destroy when by destruction the world must advance. But hate not that which thou destroyest, neither grieve for all those who perish. Know everywhere the one self, know all to be immortal souls, and the body to be but dust. Do thy work with a calm, strong, and equal spirit. Fight and fall nobly or conquer mightily, for this is the work that God and thy nature have given to thee to accomplish. Again, mainly what Sri Aurobindo is saying is that in the shloka, Bhagavan Krishna is reminding Arjuna of his duty, but he's linking it to the broader spiritual ideals as well. If you do your duty well and in the right spirit, and he's about to explain what is that right spirit, it's also a potent spiritual practice, which will bring you closer and closer to God. And ultimately, you will attain God realization, which is the highest goal of life. Okay? Okay, any questions before we move to the next shloka? Okay, now this next shloka is very interesting from a philosophical standpoint. 39. Esha te vihita sankhye buddhir yoge tvimam shranu buddhya yukto yaya partha karma bandham prahasyasi. Good. Hey Partha, Krishna is addressing Arjuna. Esha buddhihi te sankhya abhita. This wisdom that I've been teaching you, this intelligence I've been describing to you, is from the standpoint of Sankhya. What that term means, we'll discuss. That's partly what's interesting here from a philosophical standpoint. I've just told you the wisdom of Sankhya. Imam tu yogeshunu. But now let me teach you wisdom based on yoga. And now what does yoga mean? Yoga is one of the vaguest words in the Sanskrit language, in most Indian languages. So we'll also discuss what is that. Yaya buddhya, by means of which, by means of this wisdom that I'm about to teach you, the wisdom of this yoga, yuktaha karma bandham prahasyasi. Endowed with this kind of intelligence based on yoga, you will be able to break all the bondages of karma, of action. So now, there are all these controversies. There are two main questions that the shloka raises. First question is, what exactly does Bhagavan Krishna mean by Sankhya? What does he mean by yoga? Krishna is saying, I've just told you in the previous shlokas about wisdom based on Sankhya. And now, not the immediately preceding slokas. The immediate preceding slokas are just about, you're doing your duty as a kshatriya. People will criticize you or insult you if you don't do your duty. Not that, but remember, what was the previous teaching? You remember? The highest spiritual teaching, I just mentioned it earlier. You are eternal souls. You're not the body-mind complex. This is the buddhi, this is the wisdom based on Sankhya. But what exactly is it? That's one question. And then now, what does Bhagavan Krishna mean by yoga? Now he's going to teach us a different kind of wisdom based on yoga. But what is yoga? That's the first question. And the second question is, what exactly is the relationship between Sankhya and yoga? Okay? These two different kinds of spiritual practice. And different commentators have given somewhat different answers. As far as I can tell, most commentators agree. Okay, well, before we get into this, Sankhya, does that ring any bells for anybody when you hear the word Sankhya? Purvamamsa is a different school. This is one of the standard classifications. Yeah, according to a standard classification, there's 6 Astika schools of Indian philosophy. Astika means, usually it's translated as orthodox, which means they accept the authority of the Vedas. What are they? One of them you mentioned, which is Purvamimamsa. Second is Uttaramimamsa, which is the same as Vedanta. Uttaramimamsa is the same thing as Vedanta. Sankhya and Yoga are also 2 different orthodox schools of Indian philosophy, of Vedic philosophy. And then there's Nyaya and Vaisheshika. Nyaya being the school of logic, Indian logic. I've mentioned it a few times in previous classes also. So Sankhya and Yoga are also philosophical schools. Astika, they're ones that are based on the authority of the Vedas. So some people who are familiar some people who have some Indian philosophical background, they might think Krishna is talking about, maybe he's talking about the ancient philosophical school of Sankhya. That's one school. And yoga as a school, do you know who is the main, maybe not the founder, but at least the main exponent of yoga philosophy? He's very famous, exactly. Made even more famous by Ramdev because of toothpaste. And yes, so Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. So some people will say, oh, so Bhagavan Krishna has just been explaining the Sankhya philosophy in the sense of the school of Indian philosophy in the previous shlokas. Now he's going to talk about Patanjali's yoga based on the text, the Yoga Sutra. But most commentators think this is not the right way to think about it. It's not totally wrong either, but it's not the most accurate way of thinking about it. Why? It gets a little bit complicated. We have to have a little bit of background in what is Sankhya. I'm not going to go into the details. That would take a semester to discuss Sankhya philosophy. But Sankhya is widely considered to be the oldest, the most ancient school of philosophy in India. And it's a highly spiritual kind of philosophy, actually. It's considered to be a metaphysical dualism because it believes in two basic entities. Does anyone know what the two entities are? No? Purusha on the one hand, and on the other, now I give you a big hint. What's the opposite of Purusha in a way? Very good, Prakriti, exactly. There's Purusha and there's Prakriti. Prakriti, you can roughly translate it as capital N, nature. Everything you see here, it's all Prakriti in different forms. Purusha means basically soul or Atman, which is eternal. Everything in Prakriti is impermanent, ever-changing, and the Purushas are completely separate from Prakriti. The problem is, according to Sankhya philosophy, is that we mistakenly identify with our nature as Prakriti, as body minds. We stupidly think that we're the body mind, and then we suffer when the body suffers or when the mind suffers, not knowing that in our true nature, we're actually souls, we're Purushas. So through discrimination between the self and the not self, I am not this body, I'm not this mind, I'm nothing in this world, I'm actually an eternal spirit, you attain liberation from this world of suffering. This is basically, roughly, very, very briefly, Sankhya philosophy. So now you might say, well, there are parallels, right, with what Bhagavan Krishna is saying. Because Bhagavan Krishna is also telling Arjuna, you're not the body-mind complex, you're an eternal soul. That's true. There's a deep similarity between the Sankhya school of philosophy and this doctrine of the Purusha, the eternal soul, and the doctrine that Bhagavan Krishna is teaching. Oh, Arjuna, you're an eternal soul. Every one of you who are fighting, or each one of you has an eternal soul. So even if the body dies, you're not going to die. But this is something that Sri Aurobindo emphasizes. There's at least one crucial difference between the Sankhya school of philosophy and Bhagavan Krishna's teaching of this Atman doctrine. According to Sankhya, there are multiple Purushas. You have one Purusha, you have a separate Purusha, you have a third Purusha. We all have individual Purushas, different Purushas. There's no such thing as a non-dual Atman, a non-dual Purusha. Now, according to Sri Aurobindo's commentary, Bhagavan Krishna is talking about a single Atman shared by everybody. But this is controversial. I don't know if you remember, but long back, we talked, I don't remember which shloka it was. I think it was, actually, it's a shloka 12. So you can go back if you're interested. I pointed out that, so natvevaham jatu nasam natvam neme janadipaha. Shankara and Ramanuja have very different interpretations of the shloka. And Ramanuja says, see, this shloka supports my view, which is that each of us has an individual soul. Jivatma, he calls him Jivatma. I have one Jivatma, you have a different Jivatma. And Shankara says, no. It's using the plural here, not to refer to the plurality of souls, Purushas, but to refer to the plurality of bodies. But actually, all these bodies point to one Atman. Your Atman is the same as my Atman because the Atman is non-dual. So that's Advaita Vedanta. Ramanuja believes in different souls. Okay? But in any case, so I don't want to be dogmatic and tell you which interpretation is right. But according to Sri Aurobindo's interpretation, he's saying this is one crucial difference between the Sankhya school of philosophy and the way that Bhagavan Krishna teaches the doctrine of the eternal self or eternal soul. Is that for Bhagavan Krishna, there's only one soul. Ultimately, I mean that there can also be individual souls. Even Sri Aurobindo will talk about that. There's a beautiful shloka that comes in chapter 7, where chapter 7 or chapter 15, where Krishna says that I myself, as God, he's talking as God. He's saying, I become every jiva. Mamevamsho jiva loke. Each jiva, each individual soul is a portion of me. So it's not that Sri Aurobindo completely denies individual soul, but there's also a deeper non-dual self that's common to everybody. That seems to be Sri Aurobindo's understanding. Okay. So that's the word Sankhya. And what about yoga? What does Krishna mean by the word yoga? There's a hint at the end of the shloka. Karma bandham prahasyasi. You will overcome, you will transcend, you'll destroy all the bondages of action. So can any of you guess what this yoga might be? If it has to do with the bondages of action? Yeah, very good, exactly. Karma yoga. This seems to be what he means by yoga. In fact, not just here, but in later chapters, like in chapter 5, again, the term Sankhya and yoga will come up. Sankhya yoga pratagbalaha pravadantina panditaha. Only fools with very poor intellects say that Sankhya and yoga are different. In fact, they lead to the same goal. This is a shloka that Bhagavan Krishna gives in chapter 5. So these terms come up again. And there again, yoga seems to mean karma yoga. And one thing that's important to keep in mind is this is one of those issues where Shankara and Ramanuja and other commentators actually agree, thankfully. They don't actually disagree about this. Yoga here means karma yoga. Another thing to keep in mind about karma yoga in the Gita, as we're going to see soon enough, is that karma yoga and bhakti yoga are not airtight compartments, and that karma yoga itself involves bhakti. You'll see in later shlokas how that works, but basically, whatever you do, you should do it without coveting the fruits of your actions. But then what should you do? You do everything as an offering to the Lord. So that's bhakti yoga. So it's like a bhakti, it's a karma yoga grounded in bhakti, which is what Bhagavan Krishna seems to be teaching. That's why in Shankara's commentary, you find that Shankara makes almost no distinction between karma yoga and bhakti yoga, because they're almost one and the same. Okay, so now, but again, now we have to enter some philosophical controversies. Now, let's start with Shankara. I mentioned this earlier in an earlier class, but what was his philosophy? Advaita Vedanta. And according to Advaita Vedanta, what is the nature of ultimate reality? Does anyone know? Either Sanskrit, the original Sanskrit term. What is the nature of Brahman according to Shankara? You don't know either? Thought I could rely on him. Huh? Non-dual is personal or impersonal or beyond attributes. Yeah, so the Sanskrit term is nirguna or nirvishesha. Okay. So that's the nature of ultimate reality. And we are that nirguna Brahman, that impersonal, non-dual, pure consciousness in our deepest essence. And we suffer because we don't realize what we really are. This is Advaita Vedanta, right? One yoga can take us to that highest knowledge. What is that yoga? Logically? Yeah, the path of knowledge, yoga, the Jnana yoga, right? So there's only one yoga that can take us to the highest goal, which is liberation, knowledge of non-dual pure consciousness. That's Jnana yoga. Then what does Shankara say about karma yoga? Karma yoga / bhakti yoga, let's say, because the two are, as I said, kind of synonymous for Shankara. He says they're also very good. They're meant for inferior spiritual aspirants who have not yet purified their minds and who have scattered, distracted minds. Karma yoga and bhakti yoga are indispensable disciplines for purifying the mind and concentrating the mind, thereby ultimately making one eligible to practice the higher spiritual practice of Jnana yoga, the yoga of knowledge, by which alone one can attain liberation. This seems to be Shankara's scheme. So remember, the second question raised by the shloka was, what is the exact relationship between Sankhya and yoga? Different commentators will give different answers to this question. Shankara will say, if we take yoga to mean karma yoga, and now Shankara takes Sankhya to mean Jnana yoga, the path of knowledge. And he says that Bhagavan Krishna has been teaching Arjuna the highest teaching, Jnana yoga and the truth of the Atman, the non-dual self. Then he comes down a long way and then says, okay, but you're not ready for the highest knowledge. You have to purify your mind first. So now let me tell you how you can purify your mind. Through karma yoga. This seems to be Shankara's understanding of the sequence of shlokas. The logical progression starts with teaching us through Jnana yoga, we can attain the highest knowledge of our true nature as the non-dual Atman. But you have to be an Uttama Adhikari. That's the technical Sanskrit term. You have to be a fit, superior spiritual aspirant to embark on this very arduous path of knowledge. So to train yourself for it, you have to purify your mind through karma yoga and bhakti yoga. Ramanuja has a very different take on this. He agrees with Shankara that Sankhya means Jnana Yoga. But Jnana Yoga has not quite the same meaning, because remember, Ramanuja does not accept multiple, he accepts that there are multiple Atmas. Each of us has a different Jivatma. And so what he says is, Jnana Yoga is a wonderful practice. You should meditate on your true nature as eternal souls, separate from the body-mind complex. But your soul is different from my soul. That's one thing to keep in mind. And then, regarding this question of what is the relationship between Jnana Yoga and Karma Yoga, Ramanuja says, first of all, he says Karma Yoga and Jnana Yoga can be practiced together simultaneously. In fact, the two things are they complement each other. So you do nishkama karma, you work, but without coveting the fruits of your actions. At the same time, you should also be thinking and meditating about your true nature as Atmans, as eternal souls, separate from the body-mind complex. Ultimately, the combination of these two practices should culminate in Atma Avalokanam, according to Ramanuja, which means you have a spiritual realization of your true nature as an eternal soul. And then you become fit for the highest spiritual practice. Can you guess what the highest spiritual practice is according to Ramanuja? Yes, Bhakti Yoga, because he was a great Bhakta of Vishnu, Narayana, right? So he says, so he kind of turns the tables on Shankara. Oh, you're saying Bhakti Yoga is a lower practice? It's the highest practice. And your Jnana Yoga is, or not your Jnana Yoga exactly, but Jnana Yoga is a kind of a preparatory discipline, which makes you fit to practice Bhakti Yoga. What is the logic behind this? I think I mentioned this in a previous lecture, but the logic is you cannot feel true love for God until you have realized your true nature as an eternal soul. So long as you're identified with the body-mind complex, you cannot feel true longing for God, true love for God. This is the logic. And many great saints say the same thing. Sri Ramakrishna says exactly the same. So, with regard to the second question, what is the relationship between Sankhya and yoga? Ramanuja has a bit of a different answer. Shankara's answer to the question is, if Sankhya means Jnana Yoga and yoga means Karma Yoga, what is the answer? The two yogas are meant for different levels of spiritual aspirants. Karma Yoga is meant for inferior spiritual aspirants, Manda Adhikaris. Jnana Yoga is meant for Uttama Adhikaris, superior spiritual aspirants. Simple, but the same person cannot and should not practice these two disciplines together. So long as you identify with the body, you're eligible for Karma Yoga and Bhakti Yoga. The moment you realize that you are the eternal Atman, and realize not exactly in the sense of full realization, but you've significantly attenuated body consciousness, then you're eligible to practice the path of knowledge, and then you can attain the highest realization of the non-dual Atman. Okay? So now there's another question. Which one is the more plausible interpretation? Is it Shankara's? Is it Ramanuja's? Or is it somebody else's? And there's another question as well, which is, and we can't answer these questions until we actually read all 700 shlokas. So, I don't want to give you any premature answers. But this is one of these kind of outstanding questions I want to just raise, and then we can refer back to them once in a while. The question is, does Bhagavan Krishna put the path of knowledge and the path of karma yoga, on an equal footing, or is there a kind of hierarchy? And later in the Gita, another question will be raised. Does he put Bhakti Yoga and Jnana Yoga on the same footing? That's another complicated question. That'll come later. But I want you to keep in mind these two questions. Here, at least, this shloka does not seem to suggest a hierarchy. Bhagavan Krishna is simply saying, I have just been speaking to you about Jnana Yoga. Now I'm going to teach you about Karma Yoga. He's not saying I'm going to teach you about a lower practice called Karma Yoga. So at least on the surface, Ramanuja seems to be in a better position, because he's saying that Sankhya and yoga, Sankhya in the sense of Jnana Yoga and yoga in the sense of Karma Yoga, are on an equal footing. Ultimately, as preparatory disciplines leading to Bhakti Yoga. Okay. And let's wrap it up with this final shloka, 40. Neha vikramana shosti pratyavayo na vidyate swalpam swalpam, let's say swalpam apyasya dharmasya rayate mahato bhayat. Okay, so this shloka, yep. Anvaya, iha abhikrama nashaha na asti. On this path, there is no waste of effort. Any effort you put into this path of that he's about to explain, which is ultimately we're going to find it's karma yoga, the path of karma yoga. You'll find whatever effort you make on that path is never wasted. Pratyavayaha na vidyate. There are no obstacles that are going to prevent you from reaching your goal. Asya dharmasya swalpamapi mahatah bhayat rayate. Even if you practice just a small amount of this dharma, this great practice, this righteous practice, what happens? You will be saved from the great fear. Mahataha bhayat, from the great fear. And I just want to mention a couple things here. What is this great fear that you'll be saved from if you practice karma yoga? Does anyone have any ideas about this? Fear of death, that's a good one. Fear of death. Shankar and Ramanuja, again, this is one of those rare places where they agree. Both of them agree that this great fear refers to the great fear of samsara. Bhava bhaya. This is a common phrase used in bhajans and, bhava bhaya. So bhava means samsara, this fearful samsara, dreadful cycle of transmigration. Sri Aurobindo takes it more literally, and he says, more like along the lines of what you're saying, fear of death, but fear of many things, many of the kinds of worldly fears that ordinary people are plagued with. Let's look at his, I think it's in the commentary, right? Yes, look, he's explaining what he means by how he understands this great fear. Sri Aurobindo says, he's like speaking from the standpoint of Krishna, addressing Arjuna. Krishna is telling Arjuna, you are afraid of many things, afraid of sin, afraid of suffering, afraid of hell and punishment, afraid of God, afraid of this world, afraid of the hereafter, afraid of yourself. Afraid of yourself is very interesting. What is it that you are not afraid of at this moment? You, the Aryan fighter, the world's chief hero. But this is the great fear which besieges humanity. It's fear of sin and suffering now and hereafter. It's fear in a world of whose true nature it is ignorant, of a God whose true being also it has not seen, and whose cosmic purpose it does not understand. My yoga will deliver you from the great fear, and even a little of it will bring deliverance. When you have once set out on this path, you will find that no step is lost. Every least movement will be a gain. You will find there no obstacle that can balk you of your advance. So what does Krishna mean when he says that no effort on this path is lost? Swami Tapasanji has a nice insight. He says that Krishna seems to have in mind here the doctrine of rebirth. This is a journey of many lifetimes, according to Hinduism. So whatever progress we make in spiritual practice in this life, what happens when we die? Do we go back to square one? No. We pick up where we left off in the previous birth. That's the beauty of it. In fact, in chapter 6, toward the end, Bhagavan Krishna will say that people who engage in spiritual practice in this life, in their next life, they'll get a favorable birth. Favorable in what sense? Not being, born to a billionaire, not in that sense. But if you're a spiritual aspirant, you don't care about those things. You'll be born into a family that will support you in your spiritual practices. Maybe it's a very spiritual household. You might be born in a family of yogis. It's also possible. That sometimes happens. So like that. So I think this is a nice idea that this na iha abhikrama nashaha asti. No wasted effort means that whatever small amount of progress you make will carry over in your next life. And then the other thing is, again, depending on which commentator we rely on, Madhva is one of the few commentators in the Indian tradition who does not believe that everybody will be saved, that some people are doomed to eternal damnation, unfortunately. So it's kind of like Christianity in some ways. So Madhva distinguishes three categories of soul. And he says, some are mukti yogya, those who are worthy of attaining liberation and ultimately will attain liberation. Then there's a second category, one notch below, nitya samsaris, those who are doomed to eternally transmigrate. They're stuck in this hell forever. They have to come back again and again. No liberation for them. And the third, even worse category, tamo yogya. These are jivas who are destined for hell, for eternal hell. It's kind of sad, actually. So anyway, but this is a pretty bleak philosophy. That's what some people call Dvaita Vedanta. But other schools believe in what's called universal salvation. Not one soul will be left out. Every soul will eventually attain salvation. This is a beautiful idea. And some recent saints like Sri Ramakrishna, Swami Medhananda, and many others, they believe this. We're not all getting liberation in this life. That's not what they're saying. But eventually, even the tree will eventually be born as a human being, and eventually that human being, or after many births, will attain liberation. That's the idea, and that should give hope to all of us, right? Okay, good. Thank you. That was some of it was a bit heavy, especially the Sankhya yoga stuff. I hope your head isn't hurting too much. Any questions before we do a brief meditation? Yeah. It's very difficult to say. The question is, for those who are watching online, when did these schools, you mean the schools like Sankhya and the 6 schools that I was talking about, at different times, but nobody really knows. Sankhya is widely considered to be the most ancient of the schools. Okay. The fact that Vedanta is called Uttaramimamsa means that it follows, it postdates Purvamimamsa, which is the school that he mentioned, which is the school of, basically, it's sometimes called the school of hermeneutics, which means it explains the principles for interpreting the Vedas. And it's strongly focused on rituals. The Vedas tell us to do things. What? Do what? Do different rites, perform different rites. For what purpose? To go to heaven. This is the idea according to Purva. So different schools came about at different times, but nobody really knows. I don't want to give you superficial answers or. So that's the question. So when was the Gita? Another question is, when was the Gita composed? It's supposed to be part of the Mahabharata, but that doesn't help us much. So again, this is also a tricky question. Scholars, I think, roughly date it like about 200 BCE, before the Common Era, or before Christ. That's not PC anymore, so that's why they say BCE, Common Era, rather than Christ. It could be a little older, a little later. Many scholars believe that this is at least post-Buddhistic. That Gita follows the period of when Buddhism was introduced, because there are some terms which are used, like nirvana comes up. Brahma nirvana is a term that's used in several places in the Gita, which is very striking. Yeah, that's true. It can be poetic, but where does the term come from? Because you don't find it in the Upanishads, but suddenly you find it in the Gita. Anyway, these are complicated issues. But this question of, did Bhagavan Krishna know about these schools? He almost certainly knew of Sankhya in the sense of this school of Kapila and these great Ishvara Krishna. Now, yoga, Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, difficult to say. I think it might come around the same time or maybe after Gita, but again, there's no hard evidence for datings on this. But certainly it postdates Sankhya philosophy. And as I said, what he calls Sankhya is similar to Sankhya in many ways. It may not be exactly the same, but there are deep similarities. Krishna doesn't seem to subscribe to this ultimate metaphysical dualism that Sankhya is based on. Purusha, Prakriti, they're hard and fast categories. Because ultimately he'll say there's a Purushottama in chapter 15 of the Gita, which unites Purusha and Prakriti. And even Prakriti is seen to be a manifestation of God. There's a beautiful shloka in chapter 7, Vasudeva Bahunam Janmanam Ante Jnanavan Mam Prapadyate Vasudevaha Sarvam Iti Samahatma Sudulavaha. After many, many births, lifetimes of spiritual practice, the Jnani, the knower, realizes Vasudeva Sarvamiti, Samahatma Sudurlabhaha. He is the rare one, the wise one, he or she. The person who sees Vasudeva as everything. So this text, this scripture, this great scripture, Bhagavad Gita, moves in the direction of rejecting metaphysical dualism in favor of an Advaita, but what kind of Advaita? Here, Sri Aurobindo makes a nice point for the end. He says, Gita definitely teaches Advaita, but not Shankara's Advaita. Because Shankara's Advaita denies the reality of this world and denies the reality of the person of God. Whereas he's saying Bhagavan Krishna teaches what he calls the real Advaita, which is that there's nothing but God. But this world then is also God. It's not unreal. Very interesting. So we'll hopefully get to that later. Okay? So let's do a quick meditation and then wrap it up. Gently close your eyes. Concentrate on the heart center. You can picture a light or your chosen deity, Ishta Devata. I am not the body. The body is my instrument. I'm not the mind and all the passing thoughts in the mind. The mind is my instrument. I am an eternal soul. Now meditate on your nature as an eternal soul. I'll say Om, please repeat with me. Slowly sing. Om. Gently open your eyes. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat. Stop recording, right? Okay, you do it just so I don't mess anything.